Hi, everybody, and welcome to Monday's event for the Northumberland International Dark Sky Park Festival. We are going to be talking about astrophotography tonight, nightscape photography though, so a bit of a change from Saturday, which was all deep sky stuff through telescopes. Tonight we have two giants of the astrophotography world, Dan Monk from Kielder and Dr. Martin Kitchen from the Battlesteads and from Northern Experience Wildlife Tours, talking about how to set up and frame nightscape photographs with your DSLR or your mobile phone. I'm Roy. I will be hosting for tonight. And just before I hand over to Dan and Martin, I am going to give you a brief introduction, take 3 or 4 minutes just to tell you what's going on with the festival and what you can expect from tonight. And I'll just have to share screen. I don't know why I always have to do a running commentary when I'm clicking the buttons, but I do. It helps me to get through it. Here we go. I think it's that one. There we go. So, as I said, welcome. It's the first ever Northumberland Dark Sky Festival, and all online this year because obviously COVID, which hasn't been fantastic, and we hope that obviously we will see you next year and maybe even this year under our wonderful dark skies once we're all allowed to go and speak to each other again in real life. But for now, we've got a fantastic series of events this week. And actually, because it's all online, we've been able to get some fantastic international speakers as well. The festival has been put together by all 4 observatories in the Dark Sky Park and around the Dark Sky Park. Probably the most famous there being Kielder Observatory, been around for a long time, I think 2008, 2009. And that's where Dan works, and I believe that might even be one of Dan's pictures there. Also collaborating this week with us is Stonehof Stargazing, Stonehof Astronomy in the village of Stonehof, run by Liam Reed, and that's a picture of the Milky Way over the Stonehof Pavilion there. We are delighted to also see last year the Twice Brood Observatory coming online, right next door to the SIL, actually, the SIL Discovery Centre, the National Parks Discovery Centre, just up from that famous Sycamore Gap tree, and that's a view there from out of the observatory at Twice Brood. And this is one of Dr. Martin Kitchen's pictures over the Battlesteads Observatory last year, and that's the observatory I helped to build and set up, and that me and Martin and our team deliver events at in the village of Wark. So all 4 of us have decided to come together and present this wonderful series of events to you over the course of this week. And we're just really hoping that as soon as we're allowed to open our doors and welcome you back, you'll come and visit us in our wonderful Dark Sky Park. As some of you have already seen, we're using YouTube to stream this tonight, so the chat is open. Ask questions there. I will be moderating that chat, so please be kind. We'll try and get to the questions at the end, and don't forget, after this session finishes, we've got the masterclass at 8:30. So if you don't get your question answered in the end of the first session, come and join us in the second one. There'll be a little bit of a break in between, and we do ask you to please be kind in your comments. Okay. Final word from me. The final word from me tonight is to try and encourage you to support the mission of the International Dark Sky Association, which is to protect basically our nighttime environment. And there's lots of different reasons why we can and should be doing that. And if you're interested in that kind of thing, you can join the IDA in a number of different ways, and I encourage you to get across to their website and have a look. Okay, so thank you for listening to me. Obviously you've not come here tonight to listen to me, so I'm going to close that down, and I think I can now hand you over to Dan and Martin. So one of Dan or Martin has to decide who's speaking first.
I'm just going to share the screen for you guys so you can see what's going on. Well, I'll introduce myself first. So my name is Daniel Monk. I work at Kielder Observatory. I am the director of the Gillian Dickinson Astro Imaging Academy up there. And part of my role is to, well, look after our newest observatory, all of our new kit, and also running public stargazing events at the observatory every single night. And it's Martin's turn now.
Thanks, Dan. I'll introduce myself as well. I'm Martin Kitching. I'm one of the directors of Astro Ventures and the Battlesteads Observatory. And as Roy mentioned in his introduction, I also run Northern Experience Wildlife Tours. Does exactly what it says on the tin. This I've done a few online presentations over the last few months. This is a very, very different one because we're on Zoom and we're live streaming to YouTube. So the only people that I know are actually here are Dan and Roy. And they've both heard me speak a lot. I have no idea how many people I'm talking to or who. I'll just pretend that there are lots and lots of you there. So our first presentation tonight is astrophotography for beginners. So we're going to go through some basic things around equipment, cameras, lenses, and other kit that you would use, and also things like the exposure triangle. And I'm hoping that when me and Dan decided who was doing which section, we both wrote down who's doing which section. So I'm going to kick off talking a little bit about equipment. Next slide, please, Dan. So if you're taking photographs of the night sky, the equipment you use could be as basic as a smartphone. A lot of smartphones, you have what they call a pro mode, which will allow you to set the exposure time and the aperture, the ISO setting. These are all things that Dan's going to cover a little bit further on in this presentation. If you've got a smartphone that does that, then you can take photographs of the night sky with it. Probably the most important thing, I think, for nearly all night sky photography is that you've got a very, very stable base to put your camera on. Whatever your camera is, unless it's incredibly sensitive and has extraordinarily good image stabilization in it, hand holding it and taking photographs of the night sky is going to be very hit and miss. I mean, there are some cameras that can just about do it, but for the longer exposures that you need to get really nice star fields, you need it on some sort of solid platform. I considered bringing a tripod into my office now so that I can actually show you a tripod on screen. I decided not to. I don't know how many, I have about 8 tripods in the cupboard downstairs. Once you start buying equipment, you discover that you develop little ancillary fetishes for buying particular types of equipment. I have lots and lots of tripods, monopods, and I'm actually going to ask a question now, which Roy might be able to answer, Dan might be able to answer. On the YouTube live screen, are me and Dan visible, or is it just?
So what's happening as far as our guests are concerned, Martin, is they are seeing the PowerPoint presentation and hearing us.
And hearing us.
Yeah,
right.
They can see you're talking, so you're up in the little corner of the screen there.
That's okay.
So you need to be on your best behaviour.
That's what I wanted to know. Yeah, there's okay. There have only been 2 incidents involving live TV and live radio that really.
Yeah. Well, let's not
the
go
idea
on to
of
that.
ever having me live.
I think the useful thing here, and Dan and I are both muting our microphones when you talk.
Yeah.
I intend to have mine off for the whole of the thing and let you guys crack on. But everyone can see that wonderful picture. Is that you, Dan? Is it?
There we go. Excellent. Right. The reason I wanted to know that is because next slide, please, Dan. So basic equipment beyond a smartphone. And to be fair, a lot of smartphones now have extraordinarily good cameras. The one disadvantage they have a very, very tiny sensor. And having such a tiny sensor, large amounts of image noise is potentially going to be an issue. You're far better off for these wide field nightscapes using either a DSLR camera or a mirrorless camera, which are now becoming increasingly popular. I use a DSLR. Dan, I think, uses a DSLR and a mirrorless camera. So I have one of my DSLRs here. Oh, it's great. I'm using a virtual background. My camera isn't really disappearing. There. You should be able to see it now. So that's a Nikon DSLR. That's a D810. It's my go-to landscape camera, go-to nightscape camera. And you'll probably find that you need a range of lenses if you're going to shoot nightscapes. You'll need On a full frame camera like the one that I just had there, probably a 50mm lens will be just about the longest focal length you would want to use. And that's a 50mm lens just there. That weighs next to nothing. And most manufacturers make very, very good 50mm lenses. Because of the size of them, they don't have huge amounts of glass. They're not incredibly expensive or difficult to produce. Most manufacturers, their standard 50mm lens will be just about the sharpest lens that they produce, and generally quite cheap. I think that one I bought secondhand for under £100. It's probably the cheapest lens I've ever bought in 30 years as a photographer. You might want to go even wider to get really, really big views of the nightscape and the land. And then you'll probably be using a wide angle lens on a full frame camera, something like maybe 14mm up to 24mm. And that's a 14 to 24mm zoom lens. That thing's huge. That thing's almost the size of my head and incredibly heavy. And if you look there, you should be able to see it has this huge bulbous front element. It has a huge amount of glass in it. And generally, the more glass you have in a lens, the more expensive that lens is going to be. The bottom thing we have there is tripod. And as I said before, a really, really good solid base to put your camera on is probably the most important thing that you can have. Next slide, please, Dan. This gives you an idea of the sort of views that you get with different focal length lenses. So a 20mm lens on the left there, you've got a decent chunk of the Milky Way there. You've got quite a lot of landscape. It's a fairly broad vista. And then in the middle, we have a 35mm lens. So the Milky Way looks bigger, stars look bigger, there's less landscape, and there's less of the Milky Way. You're narrowing down your field of view. And then on the right, 50mm, which on a full frame sensor, I would think is about the maximum focal length that you would really want to go to. If you want to shoot things like the moon, you can shoot using a much longer lens though. You're going to have very, very short exposure times, and Dan will explain why that becomes important if you're using very long lenses. The moon, the planets, you can generally, they're very bright. You can use quite low exposure time, so a longer lens might work. I think probably one of the worst photographs I've ever taken, I took from my back garden with a 600mm lens, and that was of the center of Orion's sword with a 1 second exposure on a 600mm lens. It's an awful photograph. It's never going to be shown to anyone in public, I don't think. You're on mute, Dan.
There you go. Is that better? Can you hear me now? Fantastic. So yes, thanks, Martin. So we're going to move onto camera settings next, and we're going to chat a little bit about, once you've got your equipment, DSLR camera, lens, tripod, how do you then use it? So we're just going to go through the very basic things, through the steps that I take when I take my photographs as well. And we're going to just cover on everything that you kind of really need to do before you take a night sky image. And one of the first things I should mention is that DSLR cameras have the capability of allowing you to change every setting on the camera. So you can put the DSLR camera into manual mode, whether it's a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. And by putting it in manual mode, you can adjust all of the different settings. And that's really important when it comes to night sky photography. It's very easy. Well, I find it easy in the daytime. I don't do any daytime photography. Martin does a lot of it, so he knows a lot more about daytime stuff than I do. But if I do daytime photography, I stick the camera in auto, I stick it on autofocus, and I just click the button and it does the job for me. Whereas at nighttime, you can't do that because there's not enough light for the camera to pick up to take an automatic photograph and adjust the settings automatically. So that's the first thing I should mention when it comes to setting up your camera. You must turn it to manual mode. And another thing as well, I've got an image on the screen here where it says shooting in RAW. Cameras allow you to shoot an image where you capture every single bit of information that the camera picks up. That will be captured on your memory card. You've probably all heard of JPEGs. You know, JPEGs is the standard image you get, and everyone uses JPEGs, but JPEGs don't have as much data or as much information in them. So by changing your camera setting to shoot in RAW, you're getting as much data as possible. And by getting as much data as possible, that allows you to manipulate the image later on whenever you're processing. As we'll get into later on, you know, probably talk a lot about processing. In astrophotography, there is a lot of processing. We do a lot of stuff in things like Lightroom and Photoshop and other free software, which we'll mention later on as well. So shooting in RAW is the first thing you want to do. Make sure that setting's on. Otherwise, you're just going to have a big load of JPEGs that maybe you can't do too much to. And then the next thing, once you've got all your manual settings ready to go, we'll talk about the different settings that you can change. One of the first things I want to cover is how you're going to focus the camera on the stars. As I mentioned, you can put the camera in automatic mode and it will take a picture for you. The lens will automatically focus for you if you have enough light. At nighttime, there's not enough light for the camera to focus on. So you do have to adjust the lens manually. You have to adjust the focus. Otherwise, you're going to have an out of focus image. And we've all been there. We've all knocked the focus dials at night and we've all taken pictures that we thought were in focus, but they weren't. And it's horrible when you do that. But I'm going to quickly show you now how you can do that fairly easily. I've got an image of a camera on the screen and I've put a video on the back of it. And you can see that there is a video of some stars going in and out of focus. Now, the way I focus my camera on the stars is I literally just angle the camera towards the sky. I point to the brightest star I can find. So usually in the wintertime, it's Sirius, because Sirius is the brightest star in the night sky. I point it there and I see if I can see something on the back of my camera. On your camera, you can turn something called live view on. You can see a button on the back of the camera that says start and stop. This will be different on different cameras, by the way. This is just a Canon camera because I use Canon. But you can put the live view on and you'll see on the back of the camera what the camera lens and the sensor is picking up. You'll get a live view. And if you're pointing at a bright star, you should be able to see that bright star on the back of your camera, just about. Sometimes if it's really out of focus, you might not see it at all. And then what you do is you turn your lens to manual focus. There's usually a switch on the side of the lens. You can switch it to autofocus or manual. And by switching it to manual, that allows you full control of the focus dial. And you can see on the camera there now, the stars are nice and sharp. But if I adjust the focus and I turn the focus dial around, you'll see that the stars start blowing up a little bit. They start getting a little bit bigger. And that means they're out of focus. So you're not going to get a good image, unless if you're going for something artistic where you want out of focus stars. And then again, I'm adjusting the dial again, and I'm making the stars as small as I can possibly get them. So that's the kind of view you could get on the back of your camera. Point to a star or point to some bright stars in the sky, adjust the focus dial and make sure that the stars are as sharp as you can get them. You can even zoom in as well. So you can normally zoom into what you're looking at on the back of your camera. That allows you to focus a little bit better and make sure that the stars are nice and sharp. And then we're going to move on to the camera settings. So there's something that we call the exposure triangle. And this exposure triangle is used in all forms of photography, really, not just astrophotography, but I do think it is really important in astrophotography. When you're taking pictures of the night sky, there is a lot of, there's these three different settings that you have to get the right balance with. You have to balance them all to get the right picture. And we're going to go through the three different settings with you now. At the top of the triangle is the shutter speed. And then at the bottom left, we've got aperture. And then at the bottom right, we've got ISO, or ISO. And these three different settings can be adjusted to get the perfect exposure. You can see that the perfect exposure is right in the middle of the triangle. So we're going to start off with shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is how long your camera is exposing for. So it's how long the camera shutter is open and how long the light is getting a chance to hit the camera sensor. The The longer your shutter is open, the more light you're going to collect. So you're going to collect more light by having your shutter open for longer. And by having an open shutter, you're going to see more, right? If the camera's only open for half a second, you're not going to pick much up. If your camera's open for 30 seconds, you're going to pick up a lot more light. And just to give you an idea, normally a daytime exposure might be something like 50th of a second or 40th of a second or maybe even less. But at night, we shoot more in the seconds. We shoot maybe more 10 to 30 seconds-ish roughly is how long we leave the camera shutter open for. So that's the important thing. Remember, DSLR cameras allow you to take longer exposures. The next one, I'm going to come back to that in a second because I want to mention ISO first. See, ISO, think of it as how sensitive your sensor is. You can change the sensitivity of your sensor by changing the ISO. Now, if you have a low ISO, you're not good. The camera's not going to be that sensitive to light. So I've got two examples on the slideshow for you here. You can see ISO 100 is pretty much the lowest most cameras go to. Some cameras go slightly less than that, but 100 is the lowest ISO, which means your camera is not super sensitive. In the daytime, you would probably shoot at ISO 100 because why not? Because you've got lots of light hitting the camera. But at nighttime, because there's not much light to pick up in the night sky, you do have to increase the ISO a little bit more so your camera is more sensitive to light. But there are pros and cons to adjusting your ISO. Of course, if you increase the ISO setting, you're going to collect more light. The image is going to be brighter, which is good. But the other problem is the higher your ISO is, the more noisy your image is. You get a really, really noisy shot. And I'm hoping you can pick that out in the slideshow here. It depends on what screen you're viewing this on. But I've done two examples just from my back garden there. I've done ISO 100 and I've done ISO 51,200. And you can see that the 51,200 is extremely noisy. When I say noisy, I mean grainy. So you see all these little grains all over the image. And it almost distracts from the stars in the image. You can't really see them as well because they're lost amongst all the noise in the image. So by having a lower ISO, you get a cleaner image, but having a higher ISO, you get a noisy image. And of course, we all want a clean image because having a cleaner image means that you see more information, you see more detail, as you can see in the ISO 100 one there. So just remember that ISO adjusts the sensitivity of the sensor. So if I'd shutter speed, if I'd ISO, and I want to move on to aperture. So your aperture is the third setting, or the third corner of the exposure triangle. And the aperture is how much light enters your lens, or how big the hole is in the lens. I have made a little video there from my desk at home with one of my lenses showing you when I change the aperture or the hole in the lens, you see that the light decreases. So I'm making the hole smaller, which means less light gets through the lens. So really, the larger the aperture is, the more light can pass through the camera system and hit the sensor. So that's a good thing, right? Because if you're doing astrophotography, you need to capture more light. So by having a very, very wide aperture means you gather more light. So you see there's a theme here. The three settings I've mentioned, I've talked about light, because of course light is what we need to capture to get an image. The longer the shutter speed is, the more light you capture. The higher the sensitivity of the sensor, the image is going to be brighter. The bigger the hole is in the lens or the aperture, the more light you're going to collect. And the aperture of a lens is expressed with an F number. I've got them written along the bottom there, sometimes known as the f-stop. So aperture, f-stop, it's the same thing. So I've got at the bottom f2.8, which is quite a wide aperture, all the way up to f22. You can even go higher than f22 as well. But f22 means it's a very small aperture, meaning you wouldn't collect much light. And I don't know anybody who shoots at f22 when they're doing astrophotography. It's usually all the way down to f2.8. Some of my lenses go down to f1.4, which are extremely large apertures, and they allow you to collect a lot of light, but they tend to get very expensive when you get down to f1.4. So that's your three different settings, and by adjusting those three settings, you can get the perfect exposure. But I want to go through some of the pros and cons to adjusting the settings. So let's go back to shutter speed that we looked at earlier on. And I said that the longer the shutter speed is open for, the more light you're going to collect. I've got an example of a long shutter speed on the left-hand side there. This was when I went imaging in the Lake District This was a while ago now. It was well before lockdown. And I think it was something like a 20-second exposure. So the camera was left open for 20 seconds. And I was able to stand there and adjust the position of my arms. And you can see that I've captured motion during that 20-second exposure. You can see that my arms change position over that period of time. And this is something to remember when you're imaging the night sky, because everything is not perfectly still. Unfortunately, we live on a spinning ball, the Earth. We're rotating once every day. And because the Earth rotates, the stars appear to move around the sky. It's quite unusual to think about. You don't think of stars rising and setting, but they do. Some stars rise, some stars set, just like the sun and the moon sets. So they're moving all the time. So that means whenever you take a long exposure, you're going to capture that motion of the stars. And I've got an example for you here now. So what we want in our photographs, I mean, this is probably something more to think about when you get more serious. If you are a complete beginner, this is supposed to be for complete beginners. I wouldn't worry too much about your stars becoming sausage stars, as we call them. You can see on the right-hand side there, I've got an image called sausage stars. And this is where you capture that motion of the stars across the sky. We all want pinpoint stars, right? If you're a bit of a snob photographer like me, astrophotographer, I like my stars to be completely sharp and pinpoint. So we'll talk a little bit about how you can do that maybe in probably at the advanced one a little bit later on. But the one on the right-hand side, I think this is something like a 30-second exposure. So I left the camera on for quite a while. 30 seconds is fairly long. And you can see when I've zoomed into the image, you can see that the stars have trailed ever so slightly. Now, this is not a huge issue. Martin mentioned earlier on about camera lenses and focal lengths. So the shorter the focal length of your lens, the wider or the more sky you're going to fit in. So if you're using a really wide lens where you can fit in a lot of night sky, these sausage stars might not be much of an issue, because you've got such a wide field of view, you'd have to zoom right into it to notice that the stars were trailing or sausage-like. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. But like you say, if you're like me and I like to zoom into astrophotography images to see how much trailing there is in the image, then it doesn't really matter. But just bear that in mind. The longer exposure, the more motion you're going to get with the stars. So this brings us on to something that we call the 500 rule, which is a kind of a rule in astrophotography. 500 rule is probably a little bit outdated. We normally use 300 these days, but I'm going to just talk about the 500 rule for now. The 500 rule allows you to work out how long you can expose the camera for before you start getting noticeable star trails. So if you want your stars to be as pinpoint as possible, you can work out what exposure time you need to use for your stars to be as stationary as possible. And it all depends on the focal length of the lens. So you take the number 500 and you divide it by the focal length of your lens. And the answer to that will tell you how many seconds of exposure time you can use. I haven't got an example, and I'm terrible at mental maths, so I'm not going to bother working one out now for you. But, well, for example, if you used 500 and divided it by 50, what would that give you, Martin? It would give you 10 seconds, wouldn't it? Yeah, exactly right. So 500 divided by the 50 mil focal length would equal 10 seconds of exposure time before you start getting noticeable star trails. So you shouldn't go higher than those 10 seconds. But like I say, with modern cameras, it tends to be lower than 500. We can't get away with it as much now. Hope that makes sense. I don't know if I'm making any sense. I really don't, because I don't have any audience here. I'm literally talking to my computer. So please just ask questions, and I'm sure I'll be able to answer them and clear things up for you if you want to. That's it.
I could add something there, Dan.
Go for it. Yeah.
So Dan's just said about we now generally don't use the 500 rule. We use a 300 rule or a 400 rule. And one of the issues which we have now is if you have a camera with a very high resolution sensor, the pixels are very small. So the time taken for the light falling into one of the pixel wells on the sensor to the next one isn't going to be as long. So you start to see noticeable trailing a long way below the 500 rule with really high resolution sensors. I think my highest resolution sensor is 36 megapixels. The camera's now way beyond that. sort of 40, 50, 60 megapixels. And they will not only show up star trailing, they'll show up any sort of flaw in your lens.
So what you're saying is we need to stick to really low resolution cameras, 5 megapixels.
I still have a 6 megapixel SLR.
I've got a 5 megapixel Pentax, but it's been in a drawer. But I do have the same camera as you, the 12 megapixel Sony A7S II. I think you've got the 3, haven't you, Dan?
It sounds like you guys have got better cameras than I have.
You've got the Sony A7S, I'm sure you have.
Not the S.
But I just wanted to butt in basically to give you, we've got over 200 people viewing. We're getting lots of questions, and me and Chris Duffy are doing our best to answer them. And I think we're doing quite well so far. So yeah, you've got an audience, people are asking questions, and it's great. I'm learning things as well.
That's good. I think I'm learning things as well, to be honest. I don't even know what I'm saying. Anyway, right.
Yeah, I'm going to mute myself again and hand it back to you. And at the minute, no questions until the end, I think.
No problem. That's cool. So I'll continue on just a couple more things on settings and things before I move on to, before I hand over to Martin again. I was mentioning the pros and cons of using the different settings. So we've had a little look at the cons there of using the long shutter speed. You're going to get motion in your image. You're going to get stars moving. But the pro of that is that you're going to get more light, meaning you're going to pick up more details in the night sky. So it's about finding the right balance when it comes to your shutter speed. But of course, by adjusting the other settings, you can compensate for that. So let's say you didn't want sausage stars, right? You could then increase your ISO. You could increase the sensitivity of the sensor. And by doing that, you can decrease the exposure time. So you can get rid of those sausage stars. But the problem then is you're going to then have more noise if you have a higher sensitivity sensor. So like I said earlier on, it is about having that balancing act, if you like. And the way I usually combat things like noise and things like trailing stars is by buying very expensive wide aperture lenses. So we mentioned aperture earlier on, and about how much light comes into your camera system by having a bigger hole in your lens. Those wide apertures really do allow you to collect a lot. Like if you have an f2.8 lens, that is kind of a really good lens to start off with when you're doing astrophotography, like what Martin's holding up there. I know if you do have just a basic setup, I know I must remember this is always for beginners. So if you don't have a camera yet, or you're just buying a first camera, or you have a kit lens, as they're called. Kit lenses normally start at something like f3.5, something along those lines. So you can still shoot f3.5. There's no problem with that whatsoever. But what I find is the more you do astrophotography, the more light, the more photons you want to capture on your camera. So you end up going down the route of buying lenses with wider apertures. But an f2.8 lens is pretty good, and that's going to gather you more light. But there's also a drawback as well by using these wide apertures. When you use a wide aperture, you do get other flaws in your image as well, which is not totally, we don't really have to go through this too much, but I thought I would give it a little mention. By using a very wide aperture, you get a few little lens distortions, if you like. So you get something known as vignetting. And I've got a slide here showing you the difference between a lot of vignetting and low vignetting as well. So you can see when it says heavy vignetting, you get these really dark corners in the image. In this shot here, it's not so bad. I wouldn't really mind that. But some lenses can produce really bad vignetting. You get all these horrible kind of dark patches around the corner of your lens. Now, you can get rid of that to an extent when you're doing your processing later on. So when you get your image and put it on your computer, you can get rid of that. But I try and get rid of it as much as I can. But sometimes people do like vignetting. Sometimes it can be a good thing. So it's not a huge issue, because sometimes a vignette can kind of draw your eyes towards the subject in the image as well. So we don't have to look at that too much. But something else you get when you use a wide aperture is you get distorted stars. So what I've done in this one is I've taken two images. I've taken one at f1.4, which is the widest aperture I have, and I've taken one at f5.6. So f5.6 tends to be a really good f-stop for getting quite a nice image without much distortion. So you can see when I zoom into the corner of the images, when I look at the f5.6 one, the stars are pretty good. They're quite sharp. There's not much distortion. But if you look on the f1.4 one, right in the corner of the image, the stars look like little pigeons flying around the sky. I think they do anyway. You can kind of see those little bird-like structures. And these are known as lens aberrations. So lens aberrations are caused when you have lenses like this that go down to extreme wide apertures. You get all these unusual distortions, if you like. Now, again, this is not a huge issue, especially if you're just starting out. All you want to do is get a picture of the night sky. I wouldn't worry about this too much. This is just the kind of picky type of thing that I don't like. I don't like distorted stars. So again, it's a balancing act between your f-stop, your ISO, and your shutter speed. And then once you adjust all these different settings, you will get used to it eventually. You'll know what works for certain situations. And it's about making the best of it, really. So it's about making the best of the pros and cons. You're not going to get rid of every flaw with using certain settings. And that's one of the drawbacks when you're doing nighttime photography or low light photography. You have to try and get the right balance. And I think I'll stop there for now because I think I've gone on long enough. So I'm going to hand back over to Martin.
Thanks, Dan. So we've got a few suggestions of additional equipment that you could use. I mean, basically all you really need is a camera, a lens, and a tripod. Other things can be really quite useful. Intervalometer, which is something that connects to your camera, and you set it to take images with the same exposures at regular intervals, hence intervalometer. This is very good if you want to shoot a long sequence of images, or if there's something going on like the aurora or a shooting star shower, and you just want to set your camera on your tripod and get it going and leave it doing that, then an intervalometer would be the way of controlling it. Dew heaters are, I've actually just bought dew heaters for one of my lenses. The lens I showed you before, the big f2.8 14 to 24 millimeter, has a huge front element, and it tends to get a lot of condensation on it very quickly if the air is even slightly damp, which I think I somehow got away with it for about 2.5 years, and then I'd left the camera taking a whole sequence of shots for a time lapse, and I got home, I'd been at the observatory all night, drove home 3 o'clock in the morning and download 280 images to my computer, and the first 7 of them were beautiful, and the 8th one, it looked as though it was slightly foggy, and almost every other image, the front of the lens was completely covered in condensation. So an entire session I got 7 photographs out of. So a dew heater is a little heated band that goes around the body of the lens or the lens hood, and it just raises the temperature in front of the lens very, very slightly, so that moisture in the air doesn't condense on a very cold lens and then give you all of that fogging. Really, really useful piece of equipment. And the final thing we've got on there is battery grip. And lots of camera models have an optional battery grip. The really good thing with battery grips is they usually have room either for additional 1 or 2 batteries in the grip itself, or you might fit a couple of batteries in the grip and still have a battery in the camera. I think the one that's there, that'll be one of Dan's battery grips, and you can see the bit on the left, that actually goes up into the battery compartment on the camera, and then the batteries are in the grip itself. One of my Nikons has a grip that does that. Another one has one that doesn't involve going right into the battery compartment. So you have a battery in the lens, battery in the camera and 2 batteries in the grip as well. If you're doing a very long shoot overnight, so if you're shooting a very long time lapse, or if you're shooting a lot of video, which is very power intensive, you really don't want to just run out of battery. You don't want your camera to suddenly have not enough power left to continue. That's really not great. So having as much battery in there as you can is really useful. And you can also get third-party external batteries which have a fitting that goes into the battery compartment, and you have a lot more power from those than you would have from your standard batteries. We'll just talk a little bit about image processing. Myself and Dan both use Lightroom. We both use Photoshop, which are both products from Adobe. They're both subscription products. There is some free software that can be used though, and there are a couple that are very, very useful. I know Roy, who introduced this, uses Faststone Image Viewer, and also a piece of software called GIMP, which, as Dan pointed out earlier, looks remarkably like Photoshop. It looks so much like Photoshop, you could almost think you were using Photoshop. So both of those are available as free downloads. What I would suggest you do is download them, load an image, and then do as little as is physically possible to it. Over-processing is just about the worst thing you can do to your images. You'll ruin good images if you go really, really overboard when you're processing them. And quite often, processing can be as simple as just cropping it to get a much nicer composition, increasing the exposure if your image looks really dark, or decreasing it if your image looks really, really bright. And then you can change things like white balance. And we're going to talk more about white balance when we do the advanced Nightscape photography session later this evening. If anybody has any questions about image processing, then you can put them into the chat. Either Roy or Chris can probably deal with those questions now. If not, they'll keep them for the end and they'll throw them at me and Dan. Right. Dan, you need to unmute now.
Dan, you're muted. Dan, you are muted.
I know. I was just trying to get it. When I'm sharing my screen, I can't see my cursor's disappeared. I can't see it, so I'm trying to find the mute button without a cursor. I'm sure you muted me anyway, Roy.
I did. It's just a habit I do when I've got a number of different people doing things. If one person's talking, I make sure everyone else is muted, because not everybody does that, and it can be really off-putting when you're doing your talk and suddenly someone halfway through sneezes or coughs or something.
I know. You sometimes get a bit of feedback as well, don't you? So
you do, yeah. I love that picture.
Anyway, well, we were going to do. I mean, it's up to you, Roy. Here, we were going to do the little sort of fireside chat bit where we chat about some of our images and talk about the techniques we used. Are we happy to go ahead and do that now?
Yeah, we've got some questions. So can I find some questions at you first?
Yeah, of course you can. Yeah, go for it.
Prime lens, prime focus. What's that, and how's that different to something else? Chris has answered that, but if you've got examples, and when you were talking about Martin, when you were holding up your lenses, because the way it works when you've got a PowerPoint, you're up and in the corner. When we finish this and you take off that PowerPoint, you'll be back to full size. So that might be a good opportunity to get those two or two lenses out again and show people how big they are. But you know, prime focus, prime lens, what is that?
I'm happy to answer that one if you like. Prime lenses are just a fixed focal length. That's all. So I know Martin mentioned earlier on about a zoom lens. A zoom lens allows you to adjust the focal length. I think the one he had earlier was, what was it, 18 to 24 mil or something he said?
14 to 24.
14 to 24 mil. So zoom lenses are really good because they allow you to adjust the focal length for your scene. So if you're at your location, you're ready to take your photograph and you think, my lens is a little bit too wide or it's a little bit too zoomed in, you can adjust your focal length by doing that. But a prime lens is just a fixed focal length lens. And I must admit, I don't actually have any zoom lenses apart from my very long lens. All of my lenses are prime lenses, which is ridiculous because it's very expensive to have lots of prime lenses. But I guess the only good thing about a prime lens is they tend to be better quality because they are a fixed focal length and the lens is made for that focal length in particular, and you tend to get less distortions, if you like, than you would with a zoom lens. But that's the main difference.
You have usually quite a lot less distortion with a prime lens. Of course, zoom lenses, by the very nature of what they do in the changing of the focal length, they have a lot more elements inside the lens. They have a lot more moving parts inside the lens. So anything that isn't absolutely optically perfect is going to be getting moved around, and you often find with zoom lenses that the characteristics of that lens are different at different focal lengths. So my 14 to 24 at 14 millimeter, it has horrible chromatic aberration, the thing that Dan described as a flock of pigeons in the corner of your photograph. 14 millimeter, it's the coma in the corners of that is awful. 24, it's hardly there. It's just you've got all these moving bits of glass, and very wide aperture zoom lenses are incredibly expensive.
Yeah, so we've got some questions about Mac software, and people are actually answering that. So Rach is here, Daydream Astro, and she's talking about Affinity Photo. Do you use a Mac, Dan?
I use a Mac, yes.
Go on then.
Are you talking about just software for processing on a Mac? Yeah.
Like what's the alternative to Faststone or GIMP or Photoshop or whatever?
Well, you can use GIMP on Mac.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah, you can use GIMP on Mac. I only found that out today because I don't use free software. I use Photoshop and Lightroom. But I downloaded it today to have a little look just before tonight in case anybody asks, and it does work on my Mac. So,
cool.
So I'm glad that I did that now. Yeah, but
yeah.
Free software is fantastic, and GIMP seems to do a really good job. It is very much like Photoshop.
Yeah.
Continue.
Stuart Hogg just wanted to know simply what time of year was the Sycamore Gap photo taken, and you were up there just a few days ago. 6,000 likes on that picture.
Oh, are you talking about the one that was in the processing slide just here?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I took that one 3 nights ago. Yeah.
Luckily, Dan lives, in almost walking distance of Sycamore Gap, so it's within the boundaries of his legal ability to go for a walk.
It was during my daily exercise. I stayed in all day for that, and then I went out at night. Yeah. And I'm glad it did. Yeah, it actually, I think it's when I last checked, it was nearly on 10,000 likes on my Twitter account. So I was actually shocked at that. That was
very nice. Someone famous retweet it or something, is it?
I don't have a clue. I just I know.
R.I.P. your mentions, eh? R.I.P. your mentions. I think that's it. People are talking about Chris. Actually, is answering a few questions. Chris Duffy, our colleague up at the Observatory, is in here. Rachel's answering a few questions. People are even posting links to the downloads, GIMP and things like that. When do you use Lightroom? This is a good one, possibly an advanced answer, really, but I don't know, because what do I know about astrophotography? Who knows? I'll ask the question. When do you use Lightroom in preference to Photoshop and vice versa? And that's from Iona Hansen.
I'll answer that one first myself. Photoshop is very useful for stacking and layering images. So if you're doing multiple exposures and then stacking them, you would do that in Photoshop. Lightroom does almost everything that Photoshop does. And if you have the subscription version of Lightroom, you get all of the updates to it. And every time there's a Lightroom update, it brings in another function from Photoshop. I think the only one they will never, ever bring across will be layers. Because if they bring across layers, nobody would buy Photoshop anymore. Almost everything you need to do can be done in Lightroom. Photoshop is very much, it's a tool for some sort of very, very complex layering of images.
Yeah, I can add to that as well. For me, I do all my processing really in Photoshop. But if I want to do something very quickly, I normally do it in Lightroom. So if it's something where I just need to do a little bit of stuff to it, a light bit of touching up, I'll just get it in Lightroom fairly quickly and I'll do that. Because like you say, you can essentially do everything that Lightroom does in Photoshop as well. So, there's a lot of the same kind of things. And also something else to add as well. And I know that you, I don't know if you mentioned this just there, but you like using it for cataloging your images as well. Lightroom is a really good way of having a library of all of your images, so you can click on a date and you can see what images you took on that date. It's quite a good way of storing them and keeping track of all your images as well.
Someone has said, and I think the answer to this is probably no, based on what I've learned in the last 2 days, but I'm no expert. Can you use Deep Sky Stacker with Nightscape photography?
I'm going to say, do you want me to answer that one? Yeah. I'm going to say yes, but not with a foreground. If you're doing a wide field view of the sky just without any foreground, then yes, you could. There is software that you can use, and I'll mention this now because it's probably something that I would mention more on the later one tonight. But on my Mac, I use something called Starry Landscape Stacker, so you can stack Nightscape photographs by using something like that. So Starry Landscape Stacker, what that does is that separates your foreground and your sky, and it aligns all of your sky images, because obviously your stars are moving. So if you took lots and lots of pictures of the sky, let's say you took 20, 30, 40 pictures, in each image, the stars would have moved a little bit more. So that software will align all of your sky images, and it would stack them, and then it puts the foreground back on for you. So you have the foreground is stationary and the sky is being stacked separately. And it's actually, I use it quite often because I think it's a really good way of getting a cleaner image, especially if you're shooting at very high ISO. You get a much cleaner image by stacking. But I didn't think they'd go into that in this one. I believe I believe there is a different version called Sequitur for
Someone's just said that in the chat. Sequitur,
which is free software for Windows, but I don't use Windows. I've never used it before, but I'm pretty sure it does a similar thing to what Starry Landscape Stacker does.
What Daniel Tackley has chimed in. Tackley, I think it's Tackley. Sequitur can be used for Nightscape to separate the foreground and sky and stack them separately. So that's really interesting. I think we're getting a little bit here into advanced techniques, so which is fine, but then we'll have nothing to talk about at 8:30. Just a reminder, can I just remind everybody in the chat that when we do come to do the advanced, that is a separate live stream. So when this live stream ends, go back into our YouTube playlist for the Northumberland National Park Dark Sky Festival and look for the advanced, the masterclass, and dive in on that one. It's 8:30. Someone just, I know I interrupted you there, Dan, but I've got two things. One is I wanted to talk about very briefly the technology I like to heat lenses, and it's really simple. But also someone has asked, can we have some advice on mobile phones? And actually, I think maybe that's the question I could answer, because so before I do that though, what were you going to just say before I interrupted you, Dan?
I can't remember. Just go for
okay,
it.
Well, listen, then my top tip for if you don't have a dew heater, or if it runs out of batteries, you need a sock, right? And you make sure it's a clean washed sock as well, you know, not too crusty or anything. Cut a hole in the end of the sock, and then get a couple of these hand warmers. Pop them inside the sock and pop that over your lens. And it's not perfect, and it's not as good as a dew heating band, but if these don't ever run out of battery, and if you're stuck, they do work reasonably well. That's my low tech option. Very quickly, I'll talk just for a couple of minutes on the mobile phones, because what I've found is that I don't know a great deal about astrophotography, and I've learned so much just from these last talks, both Chris's on Saturday and yours today. But I have been playing with mobile phones for years. When I worked at Kielder Observatory in 2013, I remember putting my phone up to the eyepiece of, as it was then, the 14-inch meter and taking a picture of the moon, and someone else in the room went, "What are you doing that for?" kind of thing. And poo-pooed the idea, but it came out really well. And we've been doing that, all of us, ever since. We've all been taking pictures of the moon up the eyepieces of our telescopes ever since with our mobile phones, and it's great. Now, since then, some mobile phone manufacturers like the Pixel 4 has an astrophotography setting, which is really great. The Huawei P20, P30, and P40 Pros all have star trail settings, which is really good as well. You just set them going and off they go. And they're stacking their own kind of images and so on within that to some degree. But every single modern mobile phone, and by modern I mean definitely any phone that you've got in the last 2 or 3 years, on the camera will have a pro setting. And everything that Martin and Dan have told you tonight, everything, apart from maybe the 500mm rule, applies, the 500 rule. Everything applies. You've got ISO you can change. On most of them you have aperture, and on many of them you can set, and all of them in fact, you can set the time, the exposure time. And what I found is you can just buy a cheap selfie stick or a cheap tripod with a little adapter thing on it, and you can set that up somewhere stable like a tripod, snap your phone into it, put it on pro setting. And I would suggest if this is something you want to do, start off at an ISO of about 1600 and about 10 to 15 seconds. But really importantly here, set the timer on, because you don't have what Martin and Dan were talking about with the remote and the intervalometer. That's a really important thing. If you click the picture of your camera and you do that, you're wobbling the camera, and you don't want that to happen. So with mobile phones, you can't really set up an intervalometer. So you set the timer for 5 seconds, you press the button to start it, you step away, it'll take a picture, and then just play with those settings in exactly the same way that Martin and Dan have told you, and you will get really good, decent pictures on your phone. And if either of you two want to add anything to that from the mobile phone point of view, please do, because I am no expert.
Neither am I, to be honest, with mobile phones.
Yeah.
I've had a little play, and it's pretty impressive what a mobile phone can do. I was impressed with the kind of shots you can get just with an app and a little tripod or something, or something to rest it on.
Yeah, I think probably the best use I've found for my mobile phone is engaging in some schadenfreude when you're watching the aurora and you know one of your mates is stuck in their house.
I was in the observatory at the time when that happened. Yeah, that was great.
You were indeed.
I was doing a session at the observatory. I think was it a Tuesday? It was Wednesday, I think. And all of our aurora alarms are going off. And Martin lives about, 30 miles ish away from the observatory? Not far away. And I use this in my talks. When I do my aurora talks, I use this as an example of how local and regionalized the aurora can be, because all of our aurora alarms were going off. Martin was chatting in the chat, in our work chat. He'd stepped out of his front door and gone up to the coast, and he was taking pictures of the aurora there and sharing them in our chat. And I was showing people, I just stopped the talk that we were doing at the observatory. I stopped it and just showed them the pictures Martin was taking. And we all rushed outside expecting to see the aurora, and there wasn't even a white glow in the sky. So that was fun. Thanks for reminding me of that. So in fact, yes, Iona, the sessions are being recorded and you can watch them back.
Dan, do you just want to, you could scroll through an image every couple of minutes?
Yeah, have we got enough time, Roy? Can we have another 5 minutes or so?
We've got plenty of time. We don't have to finish at 8 o'clock. You can, Tim Wells is saying, you can get a cheap Bluetooth remote for mobile phones. And I seem to remember seeing something similar, like a little orange button or something. Probably worth Googling for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I do remember seeing something like that in the app that I downloaded for mine. I'm sure you could control it from my AirPods or something. I can't remember, but you could do something where you could just click it over Bluetooth. So you can do that as well.
Oh, actually, I know a lot of cameras are voice activated as well. Samsung's voice activation is really good. There used to be a time where we were taking the pictures, you'd hold them up to the eyepiece of the camera and just say smile, and it would take a picture. If you've got a Samsung phone, it's probably just taking a picture, thanks to me saying that. Someone's talking about image stabilization. On or off?
Off.
That's it, off.
Off. There we go. So Colin, you're bang on right there.
You want to know why? Good one.
Yeah, if your camera's on a tripod and image stabilization is switched on, the movement that it will detect is the movement of the image stabilization gyro. So what happens is you set up this bizarre feedback between your lens and itself. So it sees its own image stabilization movement as shake. So it tries harder to stabilize that. So if you try and stabilize when you're on a tripod, the chances are it'll be doing exactly the opposite. I know some lenses now have what they call a tripod mode, where presumably it only detects movement above a certain amount. But yeah, it was an issue when image stabilized lenses first came in, that the gyro would start spinning and the lens would think it was shaking. So it would the gyro a bit more.
Yeah. So we have two more, not questions as such. One was Christine Westerbeck says she was trying to take pictures of near-wise with her Canon with a 300mm lens, but the shutter wouldn't fire. And this happens a lot when she's trying to take photos of the night sky, what's going on when it's hard to focus. And Chris actually has chipped in that he suspects she had her lens on autofocus, and in low light conditions, it just doesn't work. You've got to be manual focus. And actually, Christine, if you missed it, if you go right back to the start of this video when we finish, Dan shows you how to do that with a snapshot video of the back of his camera. So do give that a try.
I can see Christine's house from mine just about.
Not sure what you need to think about that there, Christine.
There's 76 hectares of woodland in the way.
Oh, good. Okay. Colin Dawson has said that on Apple phones, you can use the volume up button on your AirPods to take a phone. I think he means to take a picture.
That's it. Yeah, that's what I saw online. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Do we have any tripod recommendations? I'm going to say, like, buy the best one you can for the most money that you have.
Yep. Manfrotto, three-legged thing.
Yeah, Benbow meant to be quite good as well.
Benro,
sorry.
Gitzo. And
I would agree with Roy there as well. Whatever you can afford, it's definitely worth investing in a good tripod. You know, I'm talking like sort of £80 to £100 ish, something along those lines, and you can spend a lot more than that on a tripod.
Yeah,
but you don't need one. You know,
I was just about to say that
if you're just starting out, you know, a simple tripod is absolutely fine.
The first tripod I ever bought was one from Jessups for 20 quid.
Yeah,
and you know what? It was fine. It's fine.
It does the job. It does the job, but the only thing is you get more serious. You know, little shakes in your tripod will annoy you, and you'll want a better tripod. You'll want something more stable, and also it's about how long they last as well. You know, it's cheaper tripods tend to break quicker, and you know, you have all sorts of things like that. But whatever you can afford, I would say go for.
Yeah, I must agree. I must say that I am looking at my next purchase, although I'm kind of thinking of a 14mm Sigma lens, fixed prime focus Sigma lens. So that might take the bulk of my money. But I am seriously looking at there's a Manfrotto one for about 150 quid, which is titanium or reinforced steel or something. It's meant to be quite solid. That's because I want to put a star tracker on it and some other bits and bobs. Are we talking about star trackers a little bit in the next one?
Yeah, we can do, definitely. We haven't we haven't planned to, but we will. We can go.
We're going to have a bit of a chat about stuff like that, aren't we? We have a couple more questions, and I'm happy to go on till about 5 or 10 past, and then we'll have a break and come back at 1/2 past. Oh, there we go. There's Apple. If you've got an Apple Watch, you can take a picture with a remote. Pardon me, on your Apple Watch as well. And the other question was, I've lost it. Here we go. Market Cross Guest House. I noticed that the sky on a lot of the photos is actually quite light. Why isn't it black or darker?
Is this on the images that you can see on the screen right now?
Well, I think it's just generally. I know me and Chris have that conversation regularly when we're talking about deep sky astrophotography, and his answer is, well, because space isn't black, actually.
Yeah.
No, the sky isn't black.
It isn't. Do you want to go first? Or?
Go on, Martin.
There's light there. Your eyes are not as sensitive as your camera sensor, mainly because your eyes send a signal along your optic nerve probably 60 times a second. So basically, we see life as a 60 frames a second video. Open your camera shutter for 20 seconds, and the sensor is gathering all of the light there, including all of the light that is too faint for your eyes to detect. So space is not black. It's everywhere you look, there's light.
I'll also add to that as well, that Earth's atmosphere plays a big part in it as well. So Earth's atmosphere scatters a lot of ambient light. So some of it could be light pollution that's being scattered by the atmosphere, sky glow. There's all sorts of different things that you get that the atmosphere causes in an astrophotography image.
And I like that one you've got behind you with the zodiacal light. Is that a recent one as well?
It is, yeah, the one behind me. Yeah, I've actually got it in the. I think, yeah, I put it in the next talk later on, so we can chat a little bit about that later on, and I'll talk about what.
When you were there, could you see it?
I could see with the naked eye. Yeah, I was.
Oh my God, I'm so jealous of you, Dan.
I was waiting for it. I knew it would be there because it's the right time of year to see it.
Yes,
and,
it is.
And I thought I'll wait for that and hopefully it'll come. And I could just about see with my eye, but there was a little bit of light pollution there as well, so I wasn't quite sure. But when I took a picture, it came out straight away, so it was lovely.
There's a question which you, Martin, might be able to answer. If with Nikons, you can set, there's a Nikon app which you can use as a remote. Now, I've got an old Nikon 3100, which I think you can buy them for 50 quid now. There's no remote for that. So when did that come in, the Nikon remote thing?
That's a good question. It's not something I've ever used. I'm going to say something now which is almost blasphemous, given that I've been using Nikon for 30 years. I've never liked any of their software.
No, right. Oof. I hope no one from Nikon is watching.
So do I.
But if you are,
I'm on my way to Sony in the next couple of months anyway. So,
yes. So Team Sony.
Sony and Canon. Can I just say I have both, and yeah, way better than Nikon.
I'd like to actually use that out in the dark skies. That'd be nice. I've had that since August and I've not been anywhere near a dark sky with it, thanks to coronavirus. So listen, folks, I think we're going to wind up this session, give our tame photographers time to have a break and whatever they need to do. We will be back for the masterclass at 8:30. And can I just say that even if you're sitting there thinking that this was too much for you to take on, come and see us in the masterclass anyway, because we can readdress any of these questions. That's absolutely fine. I think we're having a longer Q&A session, a bit more of a chat, are we, folks? Yeah.
We're going to go all night if you want to. We're going to go till midnight.
Well, you can. I'll just leave my computer running the stream. I'm going to go to bed at some point. But so if you haven't subscribed, so just as for the members of the public, if you haven't subscribed for the Eventbrite masterclass, don't worry, you don't have to. All you've got to do is stay on this channel, stay in the Astro Ventures channel, look at the Northumberland Festival playlist, and it should say Nightscape Masterclass 8:30 today, the 15th of February, and that's the one that you want to be on. And I'll leave the chat up running for 5 more minutes in case anybody has any questions, I think. But I'm going to end the live stream from our Zoom now, and we will see you in 20 minutes. Is that okay with you folks?
Yeah.
Cool. So
that's good.
Takes a